This presentation was recorded at the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit. For more information, contact pollinatorfriendly.org.
So, my name is Megan Garfinkel. I am a professor in the biology department at Chicago State University. And I'm going to be giving this talk together with JoAnn Baumgartner, who is the executive director of Wild Farm Alliance. We're going to give this talk in two parts. So I'm going to give this first part, and then JoAnn can give a little bit of an introduction for herself when she gets to the second part of this talk. Our topic, though, is supporting beneficial birds with native habitat. And just a little bit about who I am. As I mentioned, I'm at Chicago State University. I'm located in the Midwest in Illinois. And I'm a researcher that focuses on human-dominated ecosystems. So I'm interested in the ecology of systems like agricultural fields and urban areas. And I'm specifically interested in studying the ecosystem services that organisms provide to us in these really human-dominated systems. I've been working off and on with Wild Farm Alliance for many years now, and most recently, I worked with Wild Farm Alliance to help out a little bit with this tool that JoAnn is going to tell you about in the second part of the talk. This is a tool that was created for farmers to help them to be able to learn about and create beneficial bird habitat on their farms. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to give this talk in two parts. I'm going to start with a more general part as an introduction, talking about some of the research on beneficial birds and their connection to habitat. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background on what the research tells us about the connections between beneficial birds and habitat. And then JoAnn is going to give us a little more of a specific bit of information talking about beneficial birds and habitat in practice with a focus talking about the tool that Wild Farm Alliance has created. Okay, so I'd like to start just by talking about what is a beneficial bird, because this is, of course, a pollinator and mainly insect focused conference. I think that we can all probably agree that birds have their own intrinsic value. So when I'm talking about a beneficial bird, what I'm talking about more is the ways that birds can be beneficial to humans. Sometimes it's helpful to think about birds in these ways about how they can be beneficial to humans, because it's a way to help to incentivize conservation of birds and also of other different types of wildlife. And so one framework that we can use to examine the ways that nature benefits humans is by thinking about ecosystem services. And these are literally just the services that nature and wildlands provide to us as people. One reason that we might want to focus on these ecosystem services instead of just thinking about the innate value of things that should be conserved is because a lot of times people take these services for granted. And so if we can explicitly think about these ecosystem services, it's a way to get people thinking about these things that we think about as normally being free services. We can potentially even quantify them and, again, incentivize conservation of wildlands and wild organisms in order to, because they provide us these services. So we generally split up ecosystem services into these four categories. We often will talk about regulating services, which includes things like pollination, but also pest control, decomposition. We can think about the supporting services, the things that support the functioning of habitats, so photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, things like that. Provisioning services are these material benefits that we get from having wildlife and wild land. So the food that we get, the fuel, the fiber. And then the cultural services are the more non-material benefits that we get from organisms and wildlands. These are things like the aesthetics that we can enjoy of a wild area, recreational opportunities, or just a general sense of psychological well-being that we might get from simply being in nature. So I'm not going to talk about all of these different types of ecosystem services today, but I'm going to focus on a few of them and specifically talk about how birds can be beneficial from an ecosystem services framework. And because this is a pollination conference, I'm going to start by talking about birds as pollinators. And I think that this is something that a lot of times when we think about a pollinator, we might forget that birds can actually play a really important role in pollination. So this is generally in North America, we're talking mainly about hummingbirds. In Eastern North America, we're specifically talking about the ruby-throated hummingbird, but in the Western states, we've got a whole bunch of other species of hummingbirds and also some other songbirds that can also provide pollination services. So we have around 130 plant species in North America that are actually adapted for pollination by birds. And this is a list that we can see. This is a table from a paper from 1994 showing some of those North American bird adapted species. Just as an example, this is a flower, the trumpet vine, which is a North American plant, which is best pollinated by birds. And so if you look at this map here, we can see all of these light green areas are the native range of the trumpet vine. This is what it looks like when it's in flower. And the table that we're looking at here is some research that was conducted looking at the number of pollen grains that were deposited by different types of pollinators. And what we see is that the ruby-throated hummingbird was able to deposit many more pollen grains for this plant because it has been adapted to be pollinated by hummingbirds than any of the bees were able to do. So we do have these species of flowers that can be fairly reliant on birds for their pollination services. And it's important to remember that not all of our pollinators are just insects. The connection here, though, with habitat is pretty simple. So if you plant these bird-pollinated species of flowers, then that's an easy way to attract these pollinating bird species. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits that birds can provide from a cultural ecosystem services standpoint. And again, these cultural services are the aesthetics of an area, the enjoyment that we get from being in nature or from watching wildlife, recreational opportunities like, walking and jogging in wildlife or watching wildlife. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that I conducted fairly recently looking at data from urban yards in the Chicago area. And so what we were examining was what we call this noticing nature cycle, which is a feedback loop that we get between the birds that are present in someone's living space and the way that they interact with those birds and how they then manage their yard and how that then affects the birds and as well as the other wildlife. So just to sort of walk through what we're talking about here, we started by imagining that we have a yard, so someone's front or backyard, that has relatively high wildlife diversity, including a lot of the really charismatic things like birds. Birds are especially important for cultural services because they're so visible. We hear them, and a lot of people find that they're really beautiful. But this also includes other really charismatic pollinators, things like the monarch butterflies that we were just talking about in the previous talk as well, which are really charismatic. People enjoy seeing those as well. So if we start by thinking about a yard that has really high wildlife diversity, we might expect that the person who lives around that yard would have more frequent observations of the wildlife, including the birds and some of the insect pollinators. And so this might include like spending more time watching the birds or watching those pollinators. So we're increasing the interactions. And then because of those increased interactions, time spent watching the birds and the pollinators, we might get an increased interest in or connection, a feeling of connection with nature, or caring more about nature or the organisms that we see in our yard. And from there, what we get is we can see that people will actually change their management behavior at the scale of their yard. So a very small scale to increase the amount of wildlife-friendly management that they have. So they might do things like plant some of those pollinator or hummingbird pollinated flowers, or plant more flowers to attract butterflies. And then what we get from this pro-environmental yard management behavior is we're getting more wildlife coming into the yard. So this noticing nature cycle, this feedback loop, is something that occurs at a relatively small scale. And the research that I did along with some other scientists was looking at a data set from 815 urban residents in Chicago. We looked at their yards, we looked at the wildlife in their yards, and we got their attitudes about the reasons that they manage their yards in the ways that they do. And so we found that there was actually this really interesting connection, this feedback loop between these cultural services that people get from the birds. So these benefits from the birds is affecting their behavior in the ways that they then manage their yards. I did some research on a similar subject, looking at it slightly larger scale management. Along with some coworkers, we did some studies looking at rights of ways, so electric power line rights of ways near the Chicago area. And what we found is that these rights of ways, which often are fairly good habitat for pollinators, they can be managed in one of three ways in this area. So they might be managed as prairie, where they have plants that are natives that are put in, and they might be burned or managed to keep down the woody vegetation. We have these old field sites that are allowed to grow just sort of weedy over a 5-year cycle. And then we have sites that are mowed down to turf grass. And so we looked at the populations of birds that were living in these different habitat types. We looked at the pollinators that were making use of these habitat types. We found, not unsurprisingly, that the prairies, as well as to a certain extent the old field sites, had more species of birds as well as pollinators. But we also looked at the ways that people were interacting with these green spaces in their residential neighborhoods. So we surveyed homeowners that were living next to these rights of ways to see how they valued or thought about these green spaces and the wildlife, especially the birds that were living in those areas. And so what we found was that homeowners reported that wildlife observations, mainly bird observations, but also watching pollinators, watching deer, things like that, that was the most frequent activity that they actually used the right of way for. So if you were living next to a right of way, you were more likely to observe wildlife in that right of way more frequently than using it, for instance, to walk your dog or as a place for a garden or something like that. And we also found that in general, when we asked residents living nearby whether they enjoyed living next to a right of way, we found that in general, more people, so we're looking at the blue squares here, more people had a sense of enjoyment living next to the rights of ways that had higher biodiversity of birds and of pollinators. So when you lived next to a prairie or an old field type of right of way, you tended to have more of a sense of enjoyment of living there. So what we're seeing here is that birds, as well as other types of pollinators, were providing this cultural service in a variety of different ways and at different spatial scales. And that's affected very strongly by the ways that they are managed. So if you manage the vegetation in these areas to support these beneficial birds, beneficial in a cultural services way, then people are getting more enjoyment out of them. And finally, I'm going to talk about birds as agents of pest control. So this is a main way that we think about birds as being beneficial, and this is going to be a major focus of the second part of the talk for today. But we might think about birds as controlling pest rodents. So if you think about raptors, owls, hawks, things like that, they can really help to control rodent pests by eating them and also by feeding them to their young. So they've got a lot of young to raise and they have to consume a lot of rodents. That can be a major pest control service that they can provide to humans. Another way, and potentially an even more impactful way that birds can provide these benefits from a pest control services standpoint is by eating insect pests. And so this is the topic that I did a lot of my research on when I was doing my master's and my PhD degree. The research that I focused on was looking at how birds could provide substantial pest control services to farmers. And this is especially interesting because in the overwhelming majority of songbirds would be considered beneficial during the nesting season because they feed insects to their nestlings. So even if at another part of the year or as an adult, the bird mainly eats seeds or fruits, they're going to be feeding a large number of insects to their nestlings. And this really contributes to the pest control service that we can see that the birds are providing. One study estimated that insectivorous birds consume around 400 to 500 million tons of prey annually. So this comes down to a huge number of insects and other arthropods that these birds are consuming and providing a pest control service in this way. What we're looking at here on this map is a map of studies in different types of agricultural systems where people have examined how birds can help farmers to reduce pests. So each of these different points, we're looking at a study that was conducted and they found that birds provided a pest control service. We see that in crops like apples, broccoli, corn, we have chocolate and coffee. So all over the world and all different sorts of crops, we have research showing that birds can provide a substantial and significant pest control service. Some of the research that I did looking at this was focused on farms in the Midwest, specifically in Illinois, where we just have a ton of corn and soybean fields. And in the Midwest, this area where I am, as I'm sure many of you know, prairies are a really endangered habitat type, but they can support a huge number of birds. So they're really good habitat for birds as well as for other organisms. And so what I looked at was when we had cases of these cornfields that were next to prairies that were providing sources of birds, I was examining how do those birds from the prairies provide pest control services in the nearby cornfield. So I did some experiments, including an exclosure experiment where I basically set up cages that were on top of some of the corn crops near that prairie field. The cages keep the birds out, but allow the insects to come and go from the crops. And what I found was that the corn crop yield in the control plots where the birds were able to access had significantly higher crop yield than when the birds were kept out. So we're seeing this significant pest control service, which is measurable in terms of the crop yield in these sites where we have cornfields that were next to prairie. We also did some metabarcoding studies, so looked at DNA metabarcoding. We took some fecal samples from the birds to examine what they had been consuming, and we found that about 34% of the birds that we tested had recently consumed this specific pest, the northern corn rootworm, which can cause major damage to the corn crops. So this tells us a little bit about how those birds were possibly providing that service. So we have these areas where we have native prairie habitat near cornfields, and the birds from that prairie habitat are providing a major service on the nearby corn farms. Some other research I did in Northern California looking at small organic farms, I examined the probability that a pest would be removed based on where it was located within a farm field. And what I found was that these insect pest control services provided by birds were much more likely to occur on the farm field near a shrubby habitat or some sort of semi-natural habitat along the field margin. So if a farmer had a shrubby hedgerow that they had planted along the field margins, there was a much higher probability that a pest would be removed by a bird from the crops nearby that shrubby hedgerow. And other researchers have looked at this again in other different study systems. So Sarah Cross did a study looking at conventional alfalfa fields, and what she found was that birds were able to reduce the insect pests in these fields by over 33%. But she also found that fields that had at least 2 trees within them had over 13 species of these beneficial birds. But fields that had just weeds or dirt roads had only, on average, 5 bird species. So again, the habitat that's surrounding the field and also within the field has a major effect on these services that these birds are able to provide. If you create the habitat for the beneficial birds, then you're able to get that service. And just one final study that I wanted to mention, this was done in around strawberry fields in California. So they were growing strawberry crops. And what these researchers were looking at was some of these beneficial birds that were associated with eating Lygus species of pests. So that's a pest of strawberries, but birds that aren't likely to damage the crops themselves. So the birds that we're looking at here on this side of the slide, the Lygus species eaters, these are birds that are likely to consume these pests but not damage the strawberry crop themselves. And what they found in this study was that the more semi-natural habitat, so trees, sort of shrubby areas that were within 50 meters of that strawberry field, the higher density we had of these beneficial bird species. So overall, what we're seeing is that birds can be beneficial to people in a large variety of ways, including as pollinators, also providing cultural services, and also providing pest control services, both of rodents and also of insect pests. And we can manage our human-altered landscapes in ways that can encourage our beneficial birds by introducing natural habitat in a variety of different ways. And importantly, this management can be effective at a variety of different scales. So if we look at the scale of an individual person's yard, the scale of a farm field, or at a landscape scale, what we can see is that we can do different types of management in order to encourage the different types of beneficial birds that we're looking for at these different scales. So JoAnn is going to take over from here, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the more specific ways that we can get beneficial birds on our lands that we're managing.
Great, thanks, Megan. What a wonderful presentation. I am gonna, does this look okay? Does my slides look okay now?
Yes, we can see them and they look great, JoAnn.
Okay, thank you, Lori. All right, yeah, JoAnn Baumgartner. I'm based in Watsonville, California. Been working with the Wild Farm Alliance as executive director for about 24 years. And we help growers bring nature back to the farm and benefit from it. Most recently, we have been working on avian pest control and also insect pest control, beneficial insects. I was an organic farmer for 12 years, and I studied birds eating codling moth in apple orchards. So today I'm going to talk about our beneficial bird habitat assessment and native plant tool. It IDs opportunities, prioritizes and quantifies practices and management strategies, and hones native plant selections so that we can support birds best on the farm. The tool is filled out twice, and it's a scoring mechanism. So you fill it out before you do any restoration and fill it out after, and you can see a difference. I have the QR code here. Lori, I didn't send you a link, but people could take a picture of this to get to the site, and or I could send you materials afterwards. And so besides the tool itself, which right now is an Excel tool, but we hope to make it it's an Excel California tool, and we have plans to make it a national online interactive tool. We also created this guide, which helps dig deeper into how birds interact on farms and what the reasoning was behind how we rated different things in the tool. It has 7 sections, but actually it's really 2 parts. The first 3 parts, you have to fill out check boxes, and it's about landscape, because the landscape really does, around a farm, it really does influence which birds are going to show up. We don't score it very high, 5 out of 100, because landscape features are hard for farmers to influence. We do score the Farmscape features really highly, and that's putting in habitat. And farm management, we score high too. That's like reducing pesticides. Then the second section, the farmer or the conservation planner just selects the native plants that they want to use, or actually what was there before, and then after, or what they're going to plant. And you get a score, and it scores all these 4 last sections automatically just by choosing the plants. So the tool right now, it scores it automatically, and it'll look at about 160 plants in California, and about that many in the upper Midwest. And we have charts that look at those number of plants. And what we did for California was, first, we didn't create these colorful charts that actually list the plant, and then the plant characteristics and how well it supports birds, which I'm going to go into. At first, we just let the tool magically give you scoring numbers, but then we realized, wait a minute, it would be really cool to create these charts. So we did, and all we have for the Midwest right now is a chart. We don't have the full tool, but the chart is pretty cool to look at too, in California or the Midwest. So as I go through this and explain how to use it, I'm reflecting somewhat on a farm or a vineyard, Parducci vineyard, that we visited when we were field testing this tool. We're right now just beginning to use this tool with growers. We help growers put in habitat, and but we field tested the tool a bunch. And NRCS in California is just starting to use the tool also. It was the creation was funded by NRCS. So anyways, you can see with the before score, Parducci had a pretty high score, and then after, that's how things increased with habitat. And this is what you can kind of tell what's going on in Parducci. It's there's a bunch of habitat around. So with landscape, we're looking at how much around the farm is in natural or semi-natural vegetation, and there's higher points for more landscape or natural, semi-natural. We also give higher points for native, and Parducci had a mix of native and non-native and non-invasive habitat. And that's the case with a lot of farms. So that was landscape. Then we do a similar thing on the farm itself. How much habitat is there? And we're reflecting as we go through the tool on NRCS practices that can help with these kinds of plantings or actions. For the farmscape, we look at, like, say, putting in a hedgerow or field border, and if it's 100 feet or more from a road, it gets a higher score because birds, both for safety reasons and they like it quiet. They get more scores for being in quiet areas, and I think Parducci actually had some of their plantings kind of next to a busy road, but then they also had lots of others in quiet areas. Yeah, birds will not nest near like a big noisy pump, for instance, or where there's a lot of people around. Parducci did this cool thing where they recycled their or biologically treated their wastewater that they were using when processing the grapes. And so they have all these waterways and hedgerows weaving through the property and providing connectivity, which gets more points. This is not from Parducci, but it's just an example of getting rid of invasives gives more points. And these are some of the practices that can help with farmscape features, and the highlighted ones are what we did with Parducci. So another part of farmscape features is enhancing natural water resources, and that's because birds need water. They need water to drink, to clean their feathers, and some birds need mud to make mud nests. And Parducci had ditches and vegetated ditches and ponds throughout, like this pond and and this two different ponds actually. So some of the NRCS practices, they also had riparian habitat. They have 50-foot wide riparian habitat, and the wider the habitat along those waterways, the more points. Those are some NRCS practices. They had some perches and nesting structures, and so they got more points for that. NRCS practices. Now this is getting into the farm management section, where reducing toxic pesticides give you a lot of points. And what was cool about Parducci is they don't use pesticides, not even organic pesticides. They don't even trap rodents, or at least not on their production land, but they do trap rodents in their buildings. So they got lots of points for that. Another part of farm management has to do with making, instead of having huge monocultures, making smaller fields because there's more edge, and then putting in some kind of edge border really helps, like with flowers. And I should say that every time you put in habitat for birds, it's very likely you're going to help pollinators and beneficial insects. And so having pastures, having cover crops, all these promoting diversity helps and gets you better points. We also recognize that, birds can or habitat can cause issues, and so we encourage coexistence. There's a few bird species that give all birds a bad name, but even those, like blackbirds, feed insects to their young in the nesting season. So we want to coexist with them when they're good and then discourage them when they're bad. Food safety is an issue with freshly eaten crops. You don't want to have regrowing, say, lettuce under a roosting area of a tree. And then fire fuel management is something that has to be dealt with out in the West. And there's ways to do that and still have habitat. So then the second part of the tool, where the person picks the plants both before and after, and then a rating system happens that, as I mentioned, we have these charts that also manually you can do that. And so there's different plant characteristics and yeah, all this. I'm going to go into that. And here's the Midwest chart. So as it relates to climate, plants that like blue elderberry, which grows throughout most of California, is probably going to be around into the future because it's so adaptable. As opposed to this coastal buckwheat, it didn't get as high a rating in our scoring process because while we hope it'll be around, it's not as likely. And it's not to say you shouldn't plant a diversity of plants, but you should definitely have those plants that are going to be around in that mix. Another aspect of climate has to do with having deciduous versus evergreen. Evergreens mean that there's more cover from predators, from heat and cold and wind at a time when birds are getting stressed from climate change. So we rate those plants higher. Where we're getting our data from is several places. Calscape.org, which is California Native Plant Society website, is amazing source where we got size and dormancy of plants. But we also got flowering information from Calscape. We use cow floras, blooming period too. We use plants, the USDA plants database for fruiting and seeding. And when we take this national, we are probably not going to be using individual state focused databases. We'll probably go to the Biota of North America's database and USDA's databases. But we will continue to use this amazing database, which is Birds of the World, or Cornell Ornithology's Birds of the World database. It huge database of journal articles written by ornithologists. And we mined it with Cornell's agreement. And anyways, what we did was, like, say, for this habitat in the breeding range, we would look for, say, like this chestnut back chickadee, what it was using, what kind of plants it was using. And sometimes the ornithologists would report the species, like Sequoia sempervirens, but other times they would just report the genus, like Salix. So, and actually most of the time it was genus. So our data is coming from genus. And so our tool is looking at general habitat like that. And that's what, in that colorful chart, when you see that symbol, that's what that means. The darker the bird means the better the symbol, or the better the support for birds. Then these flowers actually mean flowers and fruiting. And so even insectivorous birds like tree swallows will eat berries in the winter when insects aren't around very much. We also look at caterpillars because so many birds are eating caterpillars. The data is coming from Calscape again, but that data came from Doug Tallamy's work, professor in Delaware, who's been doing incredible work about which plants are supporting caterpillars. But then we also looked at what the ornithologist said in Birds of the World, and what food birds were eating. Birds of the World data also looked at the nesting value. And then our tool produces a report. And in order to confirm that we were accurately depicting what's going on, we compared what our surveys showed with what the tool predicted. And in this case, with Parducci 23, which is the species in black font, of the 28 birds counted on the farm were predicted by the tool. And surveying these other farms, we found at which, some farms are birdier than others, but our tool closely tracked what we were surveying. So that was a cool thing. Yeah, so designing a farm to make the most out of a bird community, you want to have lots of different kinds of birds that have different foraging strategies. So some birds are flycatchers, some are aerial divers, ground foragers, some are up in the trees gleaning foliage or foraging in the bark. Others are stalking or soaring or air foraging. And so when you diversify the farm with bird-friendly practices and actions and native plants, like this farm, which has a little bit of habitat, and you diversify adding different kinds of crops, you're going to have more diversity. And then as you're planting or diversifying with like hedgerows and providing connectivity, maybe there's pastures and riparian habitat, non-cropped areas, and different kinds of crops, all means that you're going to have a lot more diversity on the habitat, diversity on the farm, and a diverse farm community. And you'll get all these birds, most likely. So in summary, our tools looking at landscape, farmscape, how to manage farms to be safer and more supportive of birds, and it prioritizes native plants for climate benefits, general food and nesting habitats. And here's that QR code again. But you can also just go to our resources page of wildfarmalliance.org and you'll find it there. I want to give a shout out to Merlin's or Cornell Ornithology's Merlin. It's a free app. And if you don't know birds very well, download this app. You press this button right here, which is the sound. It picks up sounds that the birds are singing and it tells you who's out there. And it's just super cool. So many farmers I know who really, their eyes glazed over when you talk about birds are really excited about this tool. And yeah, and I am too, as you can tell. So Wild Farm Alliance, we create videos, little 5-minute videos. We have, I don't know, maybe 18 or 20 now, where we interview researchers and we interview growers, and the growers talk about, I put in this habitat for this reason to help with pest control, and it's helping birds. And then the researchers talk about, what, the research behind it that backs it up. And we did one of these videos with Megan, which was really fun. In California, if you use pesticides, even if they're organic pesticides, you have to get continuing education units. And we have 7 hours of continuing education units about avian pest control. And Megan is in that too, which is cool. We have a 10-course virtual presentation where you could get self-certified and really learn a lot about birds. I did mention that we're working on creating this this document. It's or I think I did. or I want to tell you about it, managing pests with predators and parasitoid habitat. Right now, it's 5 of 10 major California crops. It's an excerpt, we're gonna have all 10. But what it does is look at the major crops in California, the major pests that are organic or sustainably managed farms. So it's not looking at secondary pests caused by pesticides. And then who are the beneficials that attack those pests, and how can we support them with habitat? Which will help with birds too. We have lots of different kinds of publications besides our tool and guide, and yeah, please join us. And there's my contact information if you'd like to get a hold of me or of us. So I am going to quit sharing now, I think.
Actually, you can leave that up, JoAnn, for a minute if you don't mind.
Okay.
And I'll invite Megan to come back. We have just a few questions to pose. And I was given a caution, and maybe you can confirm this if it's accurate, but that Merlin tool is so great to ID birds. And what I was told is some people are sort of turning it around and playing the bird songs to try to get responses from the birds, and that's confusing the birds, and it's not a good thing.
Yeah, I didn't know you could do that, but I do know it is not a good thing to be playing songs, because that not only confuses the birds, but sometimes they think the territory is already taken, and they'll leave when maybe they were really hungry and needed to stay there and eat. So yeah, or Megan, you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Merlin, some people have different feelings about it. I think it's really great to get people more interested in the birds that are around them and identifying them. Using it as a tool to attract the birds is not something that we want people to do. It's a tool that some researchers use in very specific and controlled circumstances, playing back the songs. But if everyone starts doing it, then it's going to be a major problem for the birds, because, like JoAnn said, they're spending so much time searching down a competitor or someone else singing, when really they should be spending that time getting a mate or actually feeding. So yeah, we want to really encourage people not to use it as a playback device to play the songs back to the birds, but instead to just listen to the birds and take in what you're hearing around you.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, I think it's perfect that we can hear your rooster in the background while you're giving a bird talk.
I apologize for that.
Oh, no, it's perfect. It's the bird dinosaurs, right? So can you give us a couple of your favorite birds that are really good at insect control? Maybe you want to pick a specific ecosystem, because that's a pretty general question.
Well, JoAnn.
You go for, yeah, okay, I'll just say woodpeckers are great. They help, they're especially in orchards, right? Because they're arboreal birds, and they are gleaning insects like caterpillars that spin cocoons on the barks of trees.
And I guess I'll just add that it's such a hard question to answer, because there are so many different reasons that we might want to attract beneficial birds. Some of it might be we want them to eat caterpillars. If you have an apple orchard and you're growing trees, you want the types of birds that are going to spend time foraging in trees. But if you're growing crops that are really low to the ground, then you might want to attract something that's going to forage lower to the ground. A pretty cool generalist species that I think is overlooked a lot is the song sparrow. They're found throughout a lot of the United States and Canada, and they are just sort of a small brown bird, but they've got a beautiful song, and they eat a ton of insects in a variety of different habitats. They're pretty generalist, so they like shrubby stuff, but you can find them in a variety of different types of places. So they're kind of a nice all-around bird. But of course, it really depends on what kind of birds you want to attract and what's the benefit that you're hoping to get.
And that's why we need all these moths that people try to get rid of, because they're part of the food web and they're feeding all our birds, right? So,
Yes, absolutely.
um,
And pollinators.
yeah. Can you talk about just hedgerows a little bit? I know that you mentioned them, but the importance and maybe what your favorite shrubs are for birds in creating a hedgerow?
Yeah, we have helped growers put in lots and lots of hedgerows here in California. We select a mix of plants that are flowering and fruiting at different times, because then there's food for the whole growing season for organisms. And some of the backbone hedgerow plants we like are like coyote brush and coffeeberry and toyon and ceanothus, and for different reasons, or some kinds of like coffeeberry, that's a fruit, or also a scrub oak will work in hedgerows. And anytime we bring in oaks, we're bringing in oaks support so many different caterpillars. So that's really cool. And then there's a bunch of, or those same species of plants I mentioned support different kinds of beneficial insects. And so, yeah, it's just a win-win all the way around. Megan studied hedgerows. So or shrubby borders. What do you think about that?
Well, and you can also see that we've got sort of a different area, different plants for different areas type of thing going on. So JoAnn is mainly based in California. So a lot of those plants are natives that you would see in California, but wouldn't necessarily work in the Midwest. I am now in the Midwest, and so we might see there might be other things that might be useful. And it really, again, it sort of depends on the situation. But I think the ones that JoAnn mentioned are great. Things that have berries and hold on to berries into the winter to provide a food source for birds after they stop eating insects, or when they're migrating through, are great as well.
Good. So this is a long discussion question, but maybe we can make it somewhat condensed. So I was told a statistic that one neonic treated seed can make a songbird sick enough so that it cannot manage its clutch. How detrimental do you find neonic treated seed to birds?
Yeah, we are working with the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides to create a document about what pesticides are terrible for birds. And yeah, that's definitely, neonics are really bad. I've also seen research that birds get disoriented and don't migrate correctly, and they don't put on enough weight. So yeah, and then they kill all these insects, then we have an insect decline. So there's so many reasons why we need to get rid of that whole genre of pesticides.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to add on is there are the direct effects of, how are they poisoning birds, but also the indirect effects. What happens when you take out just huge numbers of insects and the birds just don't have anything to feed their babies anymore? So both direct and indirect effects.
Well, thank you so much, both JoAnn and Megan. This work you're doing is really important, and we're so grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.